My daughter walked into my dark living room and froze when she saw me shaking in my chair. "Dad, where are your railroad clocks? Why is there no food?" "You get $17,000 a month," she whispered. My son smirked and said I was confused, that he would handle everything. What my son didn't know was that my daughter had already traced every stolen clock online. She pulled out her laptop, and his face turned white. Welcome, everyone. Before this story continues, please like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from. I would love to know your location. Quick note: this is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Some elements are dramatized. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental. But the message is meant to be meaningful. The darkness in my own living room was so thick I could not see the calloused palms of my own hands. Hands that had kept freight trains running on schedule across the New Mexico desert for 35 years now lacked the strength to flip a light switch. I am George Whitfield, a 71-year-old retired chief engineer for BNSF Railway. And on this night, I found myself a prisoner in my own adobe home in Albuquerque, sitting perfectly still in the armchair that Evelyn picked out the spring before she died. The silence was suffocating. This house used to hum with the mechanical heartbeat of 42 antique railroad clocks, each one a chapter of our life together, ticking in perfect synchronization like a symphony only Evelyn and I could conduct. Now the walls were bare. The shelves were empty. The only sound was the shallow, thread-like rasp of my own breathing and the distant moan of desert wind scraping against the stucco walls. A thick gray wool had wrapped itself around my brain, dampening every thought before it could fully form. I tried to remember what day it was, but the numbers slipped through my mind like sand through a cracked hourglass. Was it Tuesday? Thursday? The concept of days had become meaningless in this chemical fog that had swallowed my life whole. The air smelled of stale dust and the faint antiseptic trace of Sandra's hand sanitizer, a scent I had come to associate with the slow erasure of everything I once was. Sandra Whitfield, 41. My daughter-in-law, a physician's assistant at a family clinic on Manal Boulevard, who handled my medications with the same cold efficiency she used when drawing blood from strangers. She was the one who left the bottle on the counter every evening without fail. "Just take your sleep aid, George," she would say, her voice flat as a surgical table. "Doctor's orders. You need rest to heal." I had swallowed them without question for 2 years. 2 years of trusting the family name I had spent my entire life building with early mornings and grease-stained hands, and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that every train I dispatched arrived safely. But as the hours bled into this particular night, the weight in my limbs grew unbearable. This was not the fatigue of an old man. This was a manufactured heaviness. A chemical anchor dragging me into depths no honest exhaustion could reach. How does a man who kept 10,000-ton freight trains running on time for 35 years lose track of his own life? The question echoed through the empty hallway, mocking the weakness in my knees. I gripped the frayed armrest and attempted to stand, but my legs felt like wet cardboard. I collapsed back, a metallic taste blooming sharp and bitter at the back of my throat. The red digits of the microwave clock in the kitchen blurred into a single bloody smear from where I sat. I was starving in a house I had paid off 15 years ago. A house worth $520,000, yet I could not navigate the 20 feet to the pantry without the world tilting sideways. Then it came. 3:15 in the morning. The long, low horn of the BNSF freight train rolling through the Bareilles rail yard 6 blocks south. That sound had been the metronome of my life for 35 years. Every bone in my body recognized it, the way a mother recognizes her child's cry in a crowded room. My spine straightened involuntarily. Something deep in the mechanical core of my being, something the pills had not managed to reach, lurched awake at the sound of that horn. I knew that train. The 3:15 westbound freight, running coal from Gallup to the Pacific coast. 47 cars. An engineer named Danny Reeves on most nights. A 2-minute stop at the Bareilles signal before clearing the South Valley Junction. I knew this with absolute precision. I could recite the schedule of every train that passed through Albuquerque, the way a priest recites scripture. But I could not remember if I had eaten today. I could not remember the last time I saw sunlight. I could not tell you my daughter's phone number. Yet I knew every train that rolled through this city for the last 3 decades. The realization hit me like a coupling rod slamming into place. My professional memory was intact, untouched. It was only my daily life that had been erased. Only the parts of me that would notice the theft, the absence, the betrayal. This was not age. This was not natural decline. This was surgical. Someone had targeted the parts of my mind that would fight back while leaving just enough of the old railman alive to sign papers and nod at the right moments. I forced myself out of the chair and onto the cold Saltillo tile floor. The ceramic bit into my palms as I crawled toward the kitchen, each inch a war against the fog. The pale blue light of the desert moon cut through the window above the sink, illuminating the counter like a search beam. There it sat, a small amber prescription bottle next to a glass of water that had gone warm hours ago. My fingers closed around the bottle. The dry, papery texture of the label felt like evidence in a crime I was only just beginning to understand. I turned it toward the moonlight, squinting at the fine print. My hands trembled, but the words became clear as the horn of the 315 faded into the western darkness. Zolpidem. 10 milligrams. Not melatonin. Not a gentle sleep supplement. A powerful sedative, prescribed to someone whose name was not mine. Dispensed from a clinic sample that bore no pharmacy tracking number. I was not fading with age. I was being switched off. Night after night. Pill after pill. For 2 years. And the hand on the switch belonged to my own family. The amber bottle sat heavy in my palm like a bullet casing found at the scene of a slow-motion murder. My murder, carried out not with a gun but with a prescription label and a glass of warm water every night for 730 nights. I set the bottle down on the counter with a deliberate click, the sound sharp in the dead silence of my kitchen. And I turned my gaze toward the hallway. The moonlight stretched across the Saltillo tiles in pale blue ribbons, illuminating the path toward the living room where the east wall had once been the proudest display in this house. I knew what I would find before I reached it. Some part of me, the part that had been screaming beneath the fog for months, already knew. But I needed to see it with clear eyes. I needed the confirmation to burn itself into my newly awakened brain, so I would never doubt my own sanity again. I reached the living room wall, and my hand found the light switch. The overhead fixture buzzed to life with a reluctant flicker, casting a yellow glow over what should have been our sanctuary. The custom walnut display cabinet that I had built with my own hands in 1993 stretched across 12 feet of wall space. Evelyn had designed the layout herself, sketching it on graph paper at this very kitchen table, measuring each shelf to cradle a specific timepiece with the precision of a museum curator. 42 clocks. 42 chapters of our life together. Each one acquired on an anniversary, a retirement milestone, a birthday, or a trip to a rail yard auction, where Evelyn would squeeze my arm when she spotted one with a story worth telling. The cabinet was empty, every shelf bare. The green velvet lining showed 42 rectangular impressions where the clocks had rested for decades, ghost outlines of stolen lives. Dust had settled in the depressions like ash in an open grave. I ran my fingers across the velvet, feeling the shape of absence, the topology of betrayal mapped out in dust and empty space. How many years of love can fit inside a clock case? How many whispered conversations and shared sunrises and quiet Tuesday evenings can a single timepiece hold before it becomes more than metal and glass? I knew every single one. The 1897 Seth Thomas regulator we found at a yard sale in Flagstaff on our 10th anniversary. The 1923 Standard Electric Railway clock from the old Lammy station that Evelyn spotted beneath a pile of scrap during a weekend drive. The 1905 Hamilton pocket watch that had belonged to a Santa Fe railway conductor and still kept time within 2 seconds per day. Each one was a living piece of railroad history, and each one was a conversation with my wife that I could hold in my hands. But it was the empty space at the center of the top shelf that made my chest seize. The place of honor. The heart of the collection. The Hamilton 992B railroad chronometer, 21 joules, manufactured in 1947, the very year the Santa Fe Super Chief set its speed record through New Mexico. Evelyn had given it to me on our wedding day in 1978. She had saved for 3 years, working double shifts at the telephone company to afford it. The inscription on the back read, "To Gio, every second with you is on time. Love, Evelyn." Gone. The space where it had hung for 46 years was just a nail hole and a rectangle of slightly brighter paint where the desert sun had not faded the wall. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass door of the cabinet and felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with age or medication. Evelyn had made me promise. In those final weeks before the cancer took her in 2022, lying in the hospice bed with her hand thin as parchment paper in mine. "Protect our clocks, Gio," she had whispered, her voice barely louder than the ticking of the Hamilton on the nightstand beside her. "They are the heartbeat of our life together. As long as they tick, I am still here with you." I had failed her. For 2 years, while I sat drugged in my armchair, someone had been carrying her heartbeat out the door, piece by piece, selling our shared history to strangers who would never know that the 1897 Seth Thomas had been playing in the background when our daughter Nina took her first steps, or that the Lamy station clock had been ticking on the mantel the night Evelyn told me she was pregnant with Keith. Keith. My son. The name landed in my stomach like a swallowed stone. I turned from the empty cabinet and made my way to the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed its low, mocking tune as I pulled the door open. The interior light felt blinding after so many hours in darkness. 3 boxes of saltine crackers, a half-empty bottle of store-brand water, a single can of broth with a dented lid. No meat, no vegetables, no fruit. Nothing that a 71-year-old man needed to maintain his muscle, his clarity, his ability to fight. I checked the thermostat on the hallway wall. 55 degrees. In a New Mexico December, where the desert nights drop below freezing, they had set my heat to 55 degrees, saving pennies on the heating bill, while my legacy bled out through their fingers. My breath plumed faintly in the cold air of my own hallway, as the realization crystallized with a terrible completeness. They did not just drug me. They starved me. They froze me. They dismantled the museum of our life together and sold it piece by piece while I watched through a chemical haze too thick to scream through. This was not neglect. This was architecture. Every element designed to keep me weak, compliant, and ready for whatever final disposal they had planned. I leaned against the wall, my legs trembling, my breath coming in short bursts that fogged in the cold air. The 315 freight horn had faded completely now, lost somewhere in the western darkness beyond the Rio Grande. But its echo remained inside me, vibrating in my ribs like a tuning fork struck against iron. It had woken something that 2 years of Zolpidem could not kill. The railman, the engineer who checked every signal, every gauge, every coupling before he cleared a train for departure. That man was still alive, buried under 730 doses of chemical silence, but alive. And now he was awake. And he was furious. I looked back at the empty cabinet, at the ghost impressions of 42 stolen clocks, and I made a decision that felt as solid and irreversible as a rail switch locking into position. I would not confront them. Not yet. As long as they believed I was a hollow man, a shell waiting for the next dose, they would not expect me to fight back. But I needed help. I needed the one person Keith had worked so hard to erase from my life. I needed my daughter. I needed my daughter. But to understand why that single thought felt like reaching across a canyon with broken arms, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the exact moment when the track beneath my life was quietly switched, and I did not feel the turn until it was far too late. October 2022. The month the desert turned gold and Evelyn turned cold. She died on a Tuesday. I remember that, because Tuesdays were our days. Every Tuesday for 43 years, Evelyn and I would sit on the back portal after dinner, watch the sun bleed into the Sandia Mountains, and listen to the 7:12 evening freight roll south toward Socorro. She would lean her head against my shoulder, and the vibration of the passing train would travel through the earth, through the adobe walls, through our bodies, connecting us to something larger and more permanent than ourselves. The cancer took her in 6 months. Pancreatic. By the time they found it, the tracks were already torn up ahead. There was no switching to a different line. I held her hand in the hospice room on Lomas Boulevard while the Hamilton 992B ticked faithfully on the nightstand beside her, counting down the seconds I was not ready to lose. Her last words to me were about the clocks, about protecting our shared heartbeat. And then the ticking continued. But she did not. The weeks after the funeral are a blur of casseroles from neighbors I could not taste, and condolence cards I could not read. What I remember most is the silence, not the absence of Evelyn's voice. Though that was a wound that bled fresh every morning. It was the absence of sleep. My body simply refused to shut down. Night after night, I lay in our bed, staring at the vigas on the ceiling, listening to the clocks tick their synchronized chorus in the living room, and my mind would not stop running the same loop. The sound of her breathing, the weight of her hand, the specific way she said Gio with that slight upturn at the end, like every time she spoke my name was a small question she already knew the answer to. 3 weeks after the funeral, Keith arrived. My son, 46 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that had never known the honest grip of a wrench or the satisfying weight of a coupling pin. He had gone into logistics, then trucking, always adjacent to the railroad world I inhabited, but never quite willing to get his hands dirty in it. He pulled into my driveway in a silver pickup truck that was too clean and too expensive for a man running a struggling freight company, and he brought Sandra with him. "Dad, you can't stay here alone," he said, standing in my kitchen, with that concerned frown that I now recognize as the expression of a man calculating the value of the furniture behind my back. "You haven't slept in weeks. You're not eating. Let us move into the guest casita for a while. Just until you're back on your feet." I was too hollowed out by grief to resist, too tired to notice that his concern had a weight to it that felt more like measurement than love. Sandra smiled her thin clinical smile and began organizing my medications the very first evening. She had access to pharmaceutical samples through her clinic, she explained. "No need to bother with pharmacy lines, George. I can get you exactly what you need." The first pill was small and white and round, just a gentle sleep aid, she told me, placing it on my tongue with a latex-gloved finger as if I were a patient in her examination room rather than her father-in-law in his own kitchen. "Melatonin with a mild sedative boost. Perfectly safe. You'll finally get some rest." And I did. God help me. I slept for the first time in 3 weeks, and the relief was so profound that I wept with gratitude. I thanked her. I thanked my son for sending her to me. I trusted the family name, the bloodline, the 46 years of birthday cakes and Christmas mornings that I believed had built something unbreakable between father and son. The sleep became a nightly ritual. Sandra would appear at 9 every evening with the pill and a glass of water, and that same flat, professional smile. The dose must have increased gradually, because over the following weeks, I began to notice gaps. Hours would vanish. Entire mornings would dissolve into a gray haze. I would find myself sitting in the armchair with no memory of how I got there, the clock on the wall showing 3 in the afternoon, when the last thing I recalled was Sandra handing me breakfast. Keith handled it all. He slid papers across the kitchen table with reassuring efficiency. "Just some insurance forms, Dad. Medical power of attorney. Standard stuff. In case anything happens, we want to make sure you're protected." His pen appeared in my hand. The scratch of my signature on paper sounded distant and unimportant through the thick wool wrapped around my brain. I signed 5 documents that afternoon. I do not remember a single word on any of them. How many signatures does it take to sign away your life? Apparently 5. 5 scratches of ink while the desert sun poured through the kitchen window and my son smiled like a man who had just been handed the keys to a vault. Within a month, Keith had full financial power of attorney, access to my pension accounts, and control over every bill, every statement, every piece of mail that entered or left my mailbox. He moved seamlessly from concerned son to silent warden, and I floated through it all in a pharmaceutical haze that made every decision feel like someone else's problem. But the cruelest cut was not the money. It was Nina, my daughter. 39 years old, sharp as a signal flare, working as a software engineer at a tech company in Austin, Texas. We had not spoken in 4 years, and until tonight, I believed it was her choice. Keith had told me so with such convincing sadness in his voice. "She's embarrassed by us, Dad," he said one evening, shaking his head as if the words caused him physical pain. "She told me she doesn't want to be associated with a family of railroad workers. She said your career makes her feel like she wasted her education." The words had cut deep because they played on my oldest fear. I had always worried that Nina, with her engineering degrees and her Silicon Valley ambitions, looked down on the man who spent his life in a rail yard instead of an office. Keith knew this. He knew exactly where to place the blade. What I did not know, what I could not have known through the fog of nightly sedation, was that Nina had been calling, writing, sending gifts for my birthday and Christmas. Every single one intercepted, every voicemail deleted, every letter pulled from the mailbox before I could see the envelope. Keith had built a wall between us, using my own insecurities as mortar, and I had been too drugged to notice the construction. He did not just steal my money. He stole my daughter, and he did it by telling me she had already left. Silence in a house used to mean peace. It meant Evelyn was reading in the sunroom, and I was oiling a clock mechanism at the workbench, and neither of us needed words because the ticking filled the space between us like a shared language. Now, silence meant something else entirely. It meant no one was left to hear me disappear. The 2 years between Keith taking control and the night I found that pill bottle are not a story I can tell in sequence. They are fragments, shards of memory floating in a gray soup, each one sharp enough to cut but too scattered to assemble into a coherent picture. I will tell you what I can. I will tell you what the fog left behind. The clocks vanished one at a time. This I know because I can recall specific moments of noticing an absence. Even if I could not string those moments together into a timeline. One morning I stood before the cabinet and felt that something was wrong. The 1897 Seth Thomas regulator, the one from the Flagstaff yard sale, the one that had been ticking on the third shelf since 1984, gone. In its place, a rectangle of dust darker than the surrounding velvet. I asked Keith about it. I remember his face, the practiced ease of his expression, as he touched my shoulder with a hand that felt more like a clamp than a comfort. "It's at the repair shop, Dad. The mainspring was failing. I'm taking care of it." His voice had that frequency, that low, soothing register that people use on frightened animals and confused old men. I accepted the answer because the fog told me to accept it. The fog said everything was fine. The fog said trust your son, but a month later, another empty space. The 1923 Standard Electric from the Lamy station. Then the pair of Ball Watch Company railroad standards from the Denver auction in 2001. Each time, Keith had a reason: maintenance, insurance appraisal, professional cleaning. The excuses landed soft as snowflakes on my drugged brain, melting before I could examine them closely enough to see the lie. By the time a year had passed, the cabinet looked like a mouth losing teeth. One shelf completely empty, then 2, then 3. The ticking chorus that had filled this house since before Keith could walk grew thinner with each passing month, until some nights I would sit in the silence and wonder if the clocks had ever been real at all, or if Evelyn herself had been a dream I was slowly forgetting. The money disappeared with the same quiet efficiency. $17,000 every month deposited into my pension account by BNSF Railway, the product of 35 years of union dues and careful planning. Evelyn and I had built that pension the way we built everything, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, always with the understanding that it would carry us through our final years in dignity. Now it flowed through Keith's hands like water through a broken pipe. And I never saw a drop. When did the groceries stop appearing? When did the heating bill become something Keith decided was too expensive? These changes crept in with the stealth of a switching error that sends a train down the wrong track at 2 in the morning. By the time you notice, you are already miles from where you should be, and the momentum makes correction almost impossible. I tried to call Nina once. I remember this with painful clarity because it was one of the few moments that punched through the haze with its raw desperation. I had found the landline phone in the hallway, my fingers hovering over the buttons, and I could not remember her number. 10 digits that I had known by heart for 20 years. Gone. Erased. I stood there for what felt like an hour, tears running down my face, pressing buttons in random combinations and listening to the mechanical voice tell me the number was not in service. What I did not know was that Keith had already changed the phone plan. Outgoing calls were restricted to a list he controlled. Nina's number, along with every other potential lifeline, had been quietly removed from the system. I was shouting into a deadline, and he had been the one to cut the wire. Nina, meanwhile, was not silent. I know this now, though I did not know it then. She sent letters every month, birthday cards in March, a Christmas package with a framed photo of her team at work. Inscribed on the back, "Miss you, Dad. Call me anytime." She sent checks, $500 here and there, marked specifically for my comfort. Warm socks, a new robe. Small gestures of love launched across 1,000 miles of desert, every single one intercepted by my son, before it could reach my hands. Keith told her I had received everything. He sent thank you notes in a handwriting that must have been Sandra's, close enough to mine if you were not looking carefully. He told Nina I was doing well, keeping busy, enjoying retirement. He painted a picture of a contented old man pottering in his garden, while he systematically erased my existence behind that painted screen. Frank Harjo noticed first. My neighbor to the south, 68 years old. A retired electrical engineer who had worked the BNSF signal systems for 30 years alongside me. Frank and I used to share coffee on Saturday mornings, trading complaints about pension paperwork and stories about the old Atchison, Topeka days. When those Saturday mornings stopped, he assumed I was grieving. When they continued to not happen for 6 months, he grew concerned. When Keith told him at the mailbox that I was confused most days and not up for visitors, Frank grew suspicious. He told me later that he started watching. Not actively investigating, but paying attention the way a signal engineer pays attention to a light that flickers when it should be steady. He noticed a white van arriving at my house after midnight on several occasions. He wrote down the license plate. He noticed boxes being carried out of my front door by a man he did not recognize, a tall, thin figure with a deliberate stride who loaded them into the van with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. That man was Lyle Dunham, though I would not learn his name until much later. 58 years old, operating out of a warehouse in Las Cruces, specializing in acquiring antique timepieces and estate items from elderly owners who were in no condition to understand what they were losing. He came 6 times over 3 months. Each visit, another piece of Evelyn left this house in a cardboard box, carried by hands that had never loved her. The last visit was the worst. I was sitting in my armchair in the dark, deep in the fog, when I heard footsteps in the living room at 2 in the morning. Heavy, deliberate steps that stopped at the cabinet. The sound of glass sliding, the careful clink of metal against wood. I tried to rise, tried to call out, but the Zolpidem held me pinned to the chair like a butterfly under glass. I could only listen as the final pieces of our collection were lifted from their shelves and carried toward the front door. The last sound I heard was the faint, dying tick of the Hamilton 992B as it passed through my living room for the final time. Evelyn's heartbeat, leaving my house in the arms of a stranger, and I could not lift a finger to stop it. The last heartbeat of Evelyn in this house went silent, and I did not even have the strength to whisper goodbye. I stood in the dark hallway of my own home, the amber bottle of Zolpidem hidden in my work boot by the back door. And I faced the most fundamental problem a prisoner can face. How do you call for help when the warden has cut every wire? The landline was restricted. My cell phone was locked behind a passcode I had never set. Keith controlled the internet, the mail, the phone plan. He had built a communications blackout around me, as complete as any I had seen in 35 years of railroad operations. But Keith was 46 years old. He thought in terms of Wi-Fi passwords and deleted voicemails. He thought like a man who had never known a world where voices traveled on radio waves, where a signal could bounce off the ionosphere and reach a receiver 3 states away without touching a single cell tower. In my garage, beneath a canvas tarp under the old workbench, sat a 1984 Cobra 29 LTD CB radio. For 15 years, that radio had been my link to dispatch towers and fellow engineers when digital systems failed. It ran on 12-volt power. It needed no internet, no password, no permission from anyone. The back door opened onto the covered portal, leading to the detached garage, 20 feet across the gravel courtyard. 20 feet, that might as well have been 20 miles. But the 315 horn had given me something the pills had tried to steal. Anger. And anger burns hotter than any chemical can suppress. I eased the door open. The December cold hit me like a wall of black ice. The gravel under my bare feet felt like walking on frozen teeth. My breath rose in silver plumes against the stars burning with hard indifference above Albuquerque. I crossed the courtyard in a crouch, my hand trailing along the stucco wall for balance, and reached the garage door. Keith never locked it. Nothing inside worth stealing in his estimation. Just old tools. Just dead technology from a dead era. The smell of motor oil and soldering flux hit me like a homecoming. I found the canvas tarp, pulled it back, and connected the power leads to the 12-volt emergency battery. Positive terminal first, ground strap, antenna cable. The Cobra crackled to life with a burst of static that sounded like applause. Channel 9. Emergency frequency. I keyed the microphone, the hard plastic familiar against my palm. This is a distress call. My name is George Whitfield, retired BNSF engineer, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I need someone to relay a message to my daughter Nina Whitfield in Austin, Texas. I recited the phone number that my mechanical memory had pieced together throughout the night. Please, tell her that her father needs help. Static hissed. Seconds stretched. The cold crept through the concrete into my bare feet. Then a voice broke through, deep and grainy, with road fatigue. Copy that, George. This is Big Jim running westbound on I-40 out of Amarillo. Got your daughter's number. Give me 10 minutes. You hang tight, brother. Help is coming. 11 minutes later, the radio crackled again. George, your daughter's been reached. She's calling you back right now, on a number she says you'll recognize. The old rotary phone mounted on the garage wall began to ring. A separate line I had installed in 1981 for railroad dispatch emergencies, listed under my employee number rather than my name, a line Keith did not know existed. I had forgotten it myself until the sound of its bell cut through the darkness like a locomotive horn at a grade crossing. I lifted the heavy black receiver with both hands. Dad? The voice came thin with sleep and thick with 4 years of silence. Dad. Is that you? How do you describe the sound of a voice you believed you had lost forever? It hit me like a physical force, buckling my knees until I slid down the wall to the concrete floor. Nina, I said, and my voice broke on her name like water over a dam. They are stealing everything. The clocks, the money, the house. I cannot remember yesterday, but I remember every train that ever left my station. Something is wrong with what they are giving me. 2 heartbeats of silence. I counted them against the rhythm of my own terrified pulse. Don't take anything else they give you, she said, her voice transforming from sleepy confusion into cold surgical steel. Not a pill. Not a glass of water. Nothing. I am on the first flight out of Austin. Hold on, Dad. Just hold on. I hung up with hands shaking so badly the receiver clattered twice before settling. The relief nearly collapsed me right there on the garage floor. But I could not stay. If Sandra checked my room and found the bed empty, everything would unravel before Nina could reach me. I made it back across the courtyard on legs made of rubber and prayer. The gravel bit into my feet, but I barely felt it. I eased through the back door and pulled it shut behind me. The overhead light snapped on with a brutal click. Sandra stood by the refrigerator in her bathrobe, arms crossed, her eyes scanning me with the flat diagnostic assessment of a medical professional evaluating a problem patient. George? Why are you up? You're freezing. Her gaze traveled to my bare feet, dusted with gravel and red from the cold. Were you outside? I let my jaw go slack. I let my eyes drift toward the ceiling. I summoned every ounce of the confused old man they believed me to be. Water, I mumbled, deliberately slurred. Couldn't find the glass. She studied me for a long moment. Her head tilted slightly, like a hawk, deciding whether the movement in the grass was prey or wind. Then she reached for the pill bottle on the counter with a motion so practiced it looked choreographed. Let me get you your medicine, George. You need to rest. The hardest role I ever played was not on any stage. It was standing in my own kitchen at 4 a.m, pretending to be a dead man, while the woman poisoning me placed the kill shot on my tongue. Sandra shook a single white tablet into her palm and held it toward my mouth with the mechanical precision of someone administering medication to a hospital patient who had lost the right to refuse. I opened my lips, let the pill land on my tongue, and accepted the glass of water she pressed into my trembling hand. I tilted my head back. I made the swallowing motion. I let water trickle down my throat, but the pill stayed pinned between my tongue and the ridge of my upper teeth, a trick I had seen carnival workers use 40 years ago to hide coins during sleight-of-hand routines on lunch breaks at the rail yard. The bitter chemical taste of the zolpidem seeped into my gums as Sandra watched me with those flat clinical eyes, waiting for the telltale slackening of my jaw that would confirm the dose had landed. I gave it to her. I let my shoulders droop, let my eyelids grow heavy, let the vacant fog roll across my expression like clouds covering the moon. She nodded once, satisfied, and guided me by the elbow back to my armchair. There we go, she murmured, pulling the blanket over my legs. You'll feel better in the morning. The moment she disappeared down the hallway toward the guest casita, I spat the half-dissolved tablet into my palm and crushed it into the seam of the armchair cushion. The bitter residue made me gag, but I swallowed nothing. Not tonight. Not ever again. I sat in the dark and waited. I counted the hours by the freight trains passing through the Barella's yard, the 4:40 eastbound grain shipment, the 5:12 tanker cars heading south to El Paso. Each horn a timestamp, each rumble through the earth a reminder that my internal clock was still running, still accurate, still mine. Dawn came gray and cold through the kitchen window. I had not slept, but the clarity in my head was sharper than anything I had felt in 2 years. The absence of the drug was like removing a wet blanket from a fire. Every sense burned brighter. I could smell the dust on the bookshelves. I could hear the drip of the kitchen faucet with surgical precision. The world had edges again. Keith's truck pulled into the driveway at 7:30, the engine cutting off with a heavy metallic click that I felt in my stomach. I slumped deeper into the armchair, arranging my limbs into the posture of helplessness they expected. Slack jaw, wandering eyes, hands loose and trembling in my lap. The front door opened, and the smell of expensive coffee and Keith's aftershave rolled in with the cold morning air. "Morning, Dad." He set a paper cup on the side table without looking at me. His voice had that distracted edge, the sound of a man running calculations behind his smile. "Sleep okay?" I offered a vague mumble and let my gaze drift toward the window. He studied me for a moment, then moved to the kitchen. I heard him open the back door, step onto the portal. He was checking the courtyard. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my body still as stone. He came back inside, his boots heavy on the tile. "Dad, were you in the garage last night?" The question landed casual, almost offhand, but I heard the sharpened point beneath it. I blinked slowly, letting confusion cloud my face. "Garage?" I repeated, the word thick and shapeless in my mouth. "What garage?" He watched me for 3 seconds. Then he exhaled, shaking his head with that patronizing half-smile. "Never mind. Sandra said you were a little restless. Probably just the weather change." He patted my shoulder with a hand that felt like a claim of ownership rather than comfort. "Just relax today, okay? Big day coming up." He moved to the hallway, pulling his phone from his pocket. His voice dropped into that low conspiratorial frequency I was never supposed to hear clearly. But 2 years of zolpidem had ended last night. And my ears were the ears of an engineer who once could detect a faulty bearing in a passing locomotive by sound alone. "Yeah, it's confirmed," he said into the phone. His back turned. "Friday morning. Notary's coming at 9. I need the deed transfer docs printed and the power of sale authorization ready. Once he signs, we close with Dunham's buyer by Monday. The old man won't even know what happened." Friday. Today was Sunday. I had 5 days. 5 days until they took the house from under me, sold it to whatever predator Dunham had waiting in the shadows, and shipped me to a memory care facility where I would disappear into a system designed to forget the people inside it. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, counting the vigas, keeping my breathing slow and measured while my mind raced at the speed of a freight train clearing a downhill grade. 5 days. Nina was coming. I just had to hold this mask in place for 5 more days. Keith finished his call and spent another 20 minutes in the kitchen, shuffling papers I could hear but not see. Then his boots crossed the living room, and I felt him standing over me. "I'm heading out, Dad. Sandra will check on you at noon. Don't try to go outside, okay? It's cold and you could fall." The front door closed. The deadbolt turned from the outside. He had locked me in. The click of that lock was the sound of a man who believed he had already won. I sat perfectly still for 10 more minutes, listening to his truck start and pull away. Then I heard another engine. Sandra's sedan pulling up to the front. Her key in the lock. Quick footsteps through the hallway. Not toward me, but toward the living room. I turned my head just enough to see through the crack between the armchair and the wall. Sandra stood at the display cabinet. She opened the glass door and reached for the top shelf. Her hand closed around something I could not see from my angle, but I heard the soft click of a presentation box being removed from its mount. She tucked it under her arm and walked briskly toward the front door without a glance in my direction. Through the window, I watched her place a mahogany box in the trunk of her sedan. A box I would recognize anywhere. The custom case I had built for the Hamilton 992B in 1979, lined with burgundy velvet and fitted with brass latches that Evelyn had polished every Christmas morning. That was not just a clock leaving. That was Evelyn's last whisper being carried away in the trunk of a stranger's car. And this time, I watched it go with clear eyes, with a fury so cold and so complete that it felt less like an emotion and more like a compass needle finally locking on to true north. 5 days. Hold the mask. Let them believe the railman is dead. He is not dead. He is just waiting for the right signal to move. Nina did not just fly to Albuquerque. She descended like a sandstorm rolling off the Sandia Mountains, invisible until it is already upon you and too powerful to outrun once it arrives. Tuesday afternoon. 3 days before the notary. 3 days before my signature would erase 46 years of my life from the deed of this house. I had spent 2 days maintaining the performance of a lifetime, swallowing nothing, eating the crackers slowly to preserve my energy, hiding the undissolved pills in a slit I had cut in the armchair cushion with my thumbnail. Each morning, Sandra would deliver the dose. Each morning, I would pin it against my teeth and wait for her to leave. The fog receded further with every missed pill, and by Tuesday, the world was so sharp it almost hurt. I heard her before I saw her. The crunch of rental car tires on the gravel driveway at 2:17 in the afternoon, a time I knew Keith would be at his trucking office and Sandra at her clinic. Nina had planned her arrival with the precision of a software engineer running a calculated operation. And the timing was flawless. The front door was locked from the outside as always. But Nina knew something Keith had forgotten or never learned. When she was 16, I had shown her the spare key hidden inside the hollow base of the ceramic Roadrunner planter by the back gate. A key that Evelyn had insisted we keep there for emergencies, tucked beneath a layer of decorite gravel that no one had disturbed in 20 years. I heard the scrape of ceramic on stone, the quiet metallic click of the back door lock releasing, and then footsteps on the kitchen tile. "Dad?" Her voice was cautious, controlled, but I could hear the fracture lines running beneath it. I was sitting in the armchair where they always left me, wearing the mask out of habit, my jaw slack and my eyes unfocused. But when I heard her voice, clear and real and not filtered through a phone line, I let the mask fall. I straightened my spine. I lifted my head. I let my eyes focus on the woman standing in my kitchen doorway, and I saw Evelyn looking back at me. The same fierce, dark eyes. The same jaw set against the world. The same posture of someone who has already decided to fight and is simply choosing where to land the first blow. "Nina," I said, and my voice sounded like a man's voice for the first time in 2 years. Not a patient, not a ghost, a man. She crossed the room in 4 strides and dropped to her knees beside my chair. Her hands gripped mine, and I felt the shock register in her fingers when she realized how thin my wrists had become. She looked at my face, really looked, and I watched her professional composure crack like ice on a spring river. "Oh God, Dad, you've lost so much weight." Her voice trembled but did not break. "How long? How long have they been doing this?" 2 years, I said. I reached into the slit in the armchair cushion and pulled out the amber bottle I had retrieved from my work boot that first night. I placed it in her palm. "This is what Sandra calls my sleep supplement. Read the label." She turned the bottle toward the light. I watched her face go through 3 distinct phases in the space of 4 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then a fury so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "Zolpidem," she whispered. 10 milligrams. This is not a supplement. This is a Schedule 4 controlled substance. She looked up at me. "Dad, this dosage taken nightly for 2 years could cause severe cognitive impairment, memory loss, motor dysfunction. It mimics dementia perfectly. They've been chemically manufacturing your decline." "I know," I said. "And there's more." I led her through the house. Each room was a crime scene she was seeing for the first time. The thermostat reading 55 degrees. The refrigerator, with its pathetic inventory of crackers and dented broth cans. The bare walls of the living room where 42 ghosts of stolen clocks left their dust outlines on faded paint. She photographed everything with her phone, her jaw tightening with each click of the shutter. When she reached the display cabinet, she stood motionless for a full minute. Her fingers traced the empty velvet depressions the same way I had done 3 nights ago, reading the braille of our family's stolen history. "All of them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Every single one, including the Hamilton." She closed her eyes. I knew what she was seeing behind those lids. She was 6 years old, sitting on Evelyn's lap, watching her mother wind the Hamilton 992B with careful fingers while explaining that this clock had once lived in the pocket of a man who kept trains running on time, just like Daddy. That memory lived in Nina's bones, the way train schedules lived in mine. She opened her eyes and pulled her laptop from her travel bag, with a motion that had the deliberate efficiency of someone unsheathing a weapon. She sat at the kitchen table, the blue-white glow of the screen cutting through the dim room, and her fingers began to fly across the keyboard, with a speed and precision that reminded me she wrote code for systems that processed millions of data points per second. "If they sold the clocks, there's a digital trail," she said, her voice shifting into the flat, analytical register of a professional isolating a problem. Antique railroad timepieces are a niche market. There are only 3 major platforms where you can move that kind of inventory without questions. Within 20 minutes, she had found them. eBay first, then Chrono24. A seller account registered under the username Desert Time Deals, operating out of a P.O. box in Las Cruces, New Mexico. 12 of our clocks were currently listed for sale. She scrolled through the photographs, and with each image, I felt a fresh wound open. The Seth Thomas regulator, listed at $8,000. The Lamy Station Standard Electric, $12,000. The ball watch pair, $15,000 together. Then she stopped scrolling. Her hand went still on the trackpad. The screen showed a photograph that made my chest constrict, as if someone had wrapped a steel cable around my ribs and pulled. The Hamilton 992B. 21 joules. 1947. Photographed on black velvet under professional lighting. Its gold case gleaming. The inscription on the back partially visible. Listed at $45,000. The description read, "Estate sale. No provenance documentation needed. Serious inquiries only." Nina screenshot the listing. Then she turned to me, her eyes burning with a fury that could have melted the glass case of that empty cabinet. "They're selling Mom's memory, Dad. And they're not even trying to hide it. Money leaves fingerprints. And my daughter's mind was built to read them the way mine was built to read. Rail gauge tolerances and signal patterns. She just needed the right data set. And the criminals in my family had left a trail wide enough to drive a freight train through." We worked by the pale blue light of her laptop screen at the kitchen table, the curtains drawn tight against the December night. Nina had found the small smoke detector in the hallway with its blinking red light and recognized it immediately for what it was. Not a smoke detector. A camera. Keith's digital eye, monitoring my decline from the comfort of his office. So we communicated in 2 channels. Spoken words remained in character. The confused father and the visiting daughter having a gentle, meaningless conversation about the weather and old photographs. But the real conversation happened on yellow legal pad pages, passed between us in silence. The scratch of pen on paper, the only honest sound in the room. Nina's first target was the seller behind Desert Time Deals. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the focused intensity of a surgeon navigating tissue. She cross-referenced the P.O. box in Las Cruces with state business registrations, and within 12 minutes had a name, Lyle Dunham. 58 years old. Operating a registered business called Southwest Heritage Acquisitions, LLC. Specializing in estate liquidation and antique timepieces. She dug deeper and found something that made her pen stop mid-word on the legal pad. She turned the pad toward me. 3 other sellers on Chrono24 with near-identical listing patterns. Same photography style. Same no provenance. Needed language. Same geographic cluster in southern New Mexico. All traced back to shell companies with Dunham's name buried 3 layers deep in the incorporation documents. He was not just buying our clocks. He was running a systematic operation targeting elderly collectors across the region. Nina wrote on the pad, "This is not a one-time theft. This is a business model." I took the pen and wrote back, "What about my accounts?" She tried my bank first. Wells Fargo, the institution where I had maintained my pension deposits for 27 years. She attempted to log in, using the credentials I remembered from before the fog. Every password had been changed. She tried recovery options. The security questions had been altered. The recovery phone number redirected to a device I did not recognize. Then she hit the wall that made her face go pale in the laptop's glow. Account restricted. Owner documented as mentally incapacitated per medical attestation, filed March 2023. All access requires authorization from designated power of attorney. They had not just stolen my money. They had institutionalized my digital identity. In the eyes of the banking system, I no longer existed as a competent person. Keith had filed a medical attestation, likely using Sandra's clinic credentials to manufacture documentation of cognitive decline, and the bank had locked me out of my own life with the cold efficiency of a system that does not distinguish between protection and imprisonment. Nina's jaw tightened. She moved to the county recorder's website, pulling property records with the methodical urgency of someone defusing a bomb against a countdown timer. What she found made her hand grip the pen so hard the plastic casing creaked. A second mortgage. $250,000. Filed against my fully paid-off home in January 2024. The lender was listed as Rio Grande Estates LLC, a company registered in Las Cruces, New Mexico, the same city as Dunham's operation. She dug into the incorporation records and found Lyle Dunham listed as managing member. My son had not just borrowed money from a stranger, he had borrowed it from the same man buying our stolen clocks. Dunham was the loan shark and the fence, the supplier and the customer. A closed loop of exploitation with my life at the center. Nina wrote in large letters on the pad, "He's using your house as collateral for a loan from the same man who's buying your stolen property." I felt the room tilt. The mathematics of my destruction were becoming clear. I took the pen with a hand that shook from fury rather than medication. "How much total?" I wrote. She pulled up Keith's trucking company next. Southwest Corridor Freight, LLC. It took her less than 10 minutes to find the public filings. The company was hemorrhaging money, $600,000 in outstanding liabilities. Unpaid fuel suppliers. Equipment lease defaults. 3 former employees with wage claims pending in state labor court. The municipal contract Keith had boasted about for 2 years, the one that was supposed to turn everything around, had been canceled 8 months ago. He had been operating on fumes and fraud ever since. Nina calculated on the pad, her numbers precise and damning. Pension drained over 24 months at $17,000 per month. $408,000. Estimated value of 42 stolen clocks, sold at below-market rates to Dunham. $200,000. Second mortgage against the house. $250,000. Total assets extracted from one 71-year-old man. Approximately $860,000. How many years of early mornings and frozen rail yards and midnight emergency calls does it take to earn $860,000? I could tell you exactly. It takes 35 years. It takes a lifetime. And my son had consumed it in 24 months to feed a business that was already dead. But the final discovery was the one that turned my blood to ice water. Nina found an email thread between Keith and Dunham, forwarded carelessly to an unsecured account that Keith apparently used for personal correspondence. The subject line read, "Friday Timeline." She turned the screen toward me, and I read the words that confirmed what I had suspected since overhearing Keith's phone call. "The house closes Friday. Notary confirmed 9 a.m. After signing, we move him to Desert Pines Memory Care. Intake form already submitted. Estimated move-in Wednesday next week. Once he's in the system, the estate transfers clean. Desert Pines." I knew the name. A memory care facility on the south end of town, a place where people went in and did not come out, where families deposited their inconvenient elderly and signed away their guilt along with the admission forms. They were not just stealing my money and my home. They were planning to lock me in a box and throw away the key. And they had 3 days left to do it. Nina closed the laptop with a controlled click that sounded louder than a slamming door. She picked up the legal pad and wrote 4 words in letters so aggressive they nearly tore through the paper. "We have 72 hours. The knock on the back door at midnight was not the enemy. It was 3 soft raps, spaced evenly like a railroad signal code. A pattern I recognized from 40 years of shared shifts and emergency calls on frozen winter nights. I was sitting at the kitchen table with Nina. The laptop closed to preserve battery. The legal pad between us covered in her tight engineering script, mapping the architecture of my ruin. We both froze at the sound. Nina's hand moved to her phone, ready to dial 911, but I caught her wrist. I knew that knock. I had heard it 1,000 times at the dispatch window of the Albuquerque rail yard when a fellow engineer needed to talk about something the radios should not carry. I moved to the back door and peered through the small glass pane. In the thin blue moonlight stood Frank Harjo, 68 years old, retired electrical engineer, BNSF, Signal Division. My neighbor of 23 years and the man who had wired every signal relay between Albuquerque and Gallup during the same decades, I spent keeping the trains that passed those signals running on time. His face was drawn tight, with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a suspicion for months and has finally found someone willing to listen. I opened the door. The cold desert air rushed in, carrying the smell of pinyon smoke from a neighbor's fireplace and the distant metallic tang of the rail yard. George. Frank's voice was low and steady. He looked past me to Nina, and something in his face shifted from concern to relief. Thank God. I was hoping she'd come. He stepped inside, stamping the red dust off his boots on the mat. Keith told the boys at the Union Hall you'd lost your mind completely. Said you were being moved to a facility next week. I didn't believe a word of it. Not after what I've been seeing. He reached into the inside pocket of his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind engineers carried in their breast pockets for jotting down readings and observations. He set it on the table beside Nina's legal pad and flipped it open. 6 pages of meticulous notes, written in the small, precise hand of a man trained to document electrical measurements to the 100th decimal. License plate numbers. 6 of them, all recorded between September and November. A white panel van, New Mexico plates, registered to Southwest Heritage Acquisitions LLC in Las Cruces. Dates and times of arrival. Always between 1 and 3 in the morning. A physical description of the driver. Tall, thin, gray hair pulled back. Deliberate movements. And photographs. Frank pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through a series of images taken from his side yard through the gap in the coyote fence. Dark, grainy, but clear enough. A man loading rectangular boxes into the van. The shape of those boxes was unmistakable. Clock cases. I started watching in August, Frank said, pulling a chair to the table. When Keith told me you weren't up for Saturday coffee anymore, I figured grief. When it went on for 6 months, I figured something else. Then I started seeing that van. He tapped the notebook. Same van, same time, same driver. Always leaves with boxes. Never brings anything in. That's not a delivery service, George. That's a heist in slow motion. Nina was already cross-referencing the plate numbers with the data she had gathered. 2 of them matched vehicles registered to Dunham's network. She looked up at Frank with an expression that combined gratitude and grim determination in equal measure. Mr. Harjo, would you be willing to testify to what you've seen? I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 4 months, he replied. Your brother told everyone you abandoned your father. I know a lie when I hear one. Signal engineers spend their whole careers making sure the right light shows at the right time. Keith's been showing the wrong signal since the day he moved in here. Nina excused herself to the back portal, stepping into the cold to make a phone call she did not want the camera in the hallway to record. When she returned 10 minutes later, her face had the focused calm of someone who has just placed the final piece of a complex puzzle. Margaret Chen, she said, writing the name on the legal pad. Senior investigator, New Mexico Attorney General's Office, Elder Abuse Division. I sent her everything. The pill bottle photos, the bank records, the eBay listings, Frank's documentation, the email about Desert Pines. She paused. She called me back within 3 minutes. That's not normal response time for a state agency at midnight. Nina explained that Margaret had recognized Dunham's name immediately. 2 prior complaints had been filed against Southwest Heritage Acquisitions in the past 18 months, both involving elderly collectors in Doña Ana County who had lost valuable estate items under suspicious circumstances. Neither case had generated enough evidence to prosecute. Until now. Our evidence, combined with Frank's photographic documentation and the digital paper trail Nina had assembled, gave them the probable cause they needed for a full investigation. But Margaret had said something else. Something that expanded the scope of this nightmare, far beyond my living room. Nina wrote it on the pad in careful capital letters. If your evidence is accurate, this is not just elder abuse. This is a RICO pattern enterprise operating across 3 counties. We move Friday. Friday. The same day Keith had scheduled the notary. The same day they planned to take my house and ship me to Desert Pines. Margaret Chen would be there. But instead of witnessing my signature, she would be witnessing an arrest. Frank left through the back door at 1 a.m. with a handshake that felt like a blood oath between 2 men who had spent their lives keeping dangerous machines running safely. Before he disappeared into the shadows of his yard, he turned back. Your wife would be proud of you, George. Both of you. He nodded toward the kitchen where Nina sat. Evelyn always said that girl had iron in her spine. We spent the remaining hours of Wednesday night refining the plan. Nina would leave before dawn and stay at a motel on Central Avenue, out of Keith's awareness. Coordinating with Margaret Chen remotely, I would continue the performance. 2 more days of the vacant stare and the slack jaw. 2 more mornings of hiding pills under my tongue. The hardest acting of my life, knowing that the final curtain was only 48 hours away. Thursday evening, Keith called. I let the answering machine pick up, my body rigid in the armchair, as his voice filled the dark room. Hey Dad, just checking in. Big day tomorrow. The nice lady from the bank is coming by to help us get some paperwork sorted. Nothing complicated. Just sign where they tell you, and everything will be fine. I'll bring breakfast. Your favorite, green chile and eggs from Frontier. His voice softened into something that might have been genuine warmth if I did not know it was a performance as calculated as my own. Get some good sleep tonight, okay? Love you, Dad. The machine clicked off. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, coiled. A spring compressed to its limit, waiting for the release that Friday morning would bring. I looked at the bare wall where the Hamilton 992B had hung for 46 years, and I whispered to the empty room, "One more night, Evelyn. One more night, and then we take it all back." The night before a man either loses everything or takes it all back is the longest night a clock can measure. And I should know. I have spent my life measuring time. Thursday bled into Friday with the slow reluctance of a train pulling into its final station. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the vigas on the ceiling, counting the hand-carved beams the way I used to count the seconds between signal lights on a dark stretch of track. 1, 2, 3, 12 beams. 12 hours until the notary arrived. 12 hours until either Margaret Chen walked through my door with a badge, or Keith walked me out of it for the last time. The house was silent in that particular way. It had been silent for 2 years. The silence of missing clocks. 42 timepieces used to fill these rooms with a layered symphony of ticking, each one slightly out of sync with the others, creating a texture of sound that was as alive and breathing as the house itself. Evelyn used to say it sounded like the house had a heartbeat. Now the silence was the flatline that proved she was right. I reached toward the nightstand out of habit, my fingers seeking the familiar weight of the Hamilton 992B that had lived there since 1978. They found only the cold, bare wood and a ring of dust where the clock's base had rested for 46 years. The absence was a wound that would not close. 3:15 came. The freight horn rolled through the darkness from the Barella's yard, low and long and mournful in the winter air. I listened to it with every fiber of my being. Not because I needed it to wake me tonight, but because I wanted to hear it as a free man. Tomorrow, if everything went right, this sound would no longer be an alarm pulling me from chemical sleep. It would be what it had always been. A lullaby. A reminder that the world was still turning, still moving, still running on schedule. But if everything went wrong, this might be the last time I heard it from this bed, from this house. Desert Pines was on the south side of the city, far from the rail lines. There would be no 315 horn in that place, only the sound of institutional heating and the shuffle of soft-soled shoes on linoleum floors. The thought made my chest constrict until breathing became a conscious effort. I closed my eyes and let the memory come. Evelyn's last night. October 14th, 2022. The hospice room on Lomas Boulevard smelled of antiseptic and the lilies someone had placed on the windowsill, their sweetness cloying against the clinical air. She was so small in that bed, smaller than I had ever seen her, as if the cancer had not just consumed her body but compressed her into something that could fit through the narrow doorway between this world and whatever waited beyond it. The Hamilton sat on the nightstand beside her, ticking its faithful rhythm. She had asked me to bring it from home. "I want to hear our time," she had whispered, her voice thin as tissue paper. "I want to know exactly when I leave." I held her hand. The bones felt like bird bones beneath the papery skin. Her eyes found mine with a clarity that the morphine could not dim. "Gio, listen to me." Each word cost her something I could see leaving her face. "Keith is not strong. He was never strong the way you are. He bends toward whatever pressure pushes hardest. You have to watch him. Promise me you will watch him." "I promise," I said. And I meant it with everything I was. "And the clocks." Her fingers tightened on mine with surprising force. "They are not just metal and glass. They are every morning we wound them together. Every Sunday we polished them side by side. Every anniversary we celebrated by adding one more voice to the chorus. As long as they tick, I am still in this house with you. Protect them, Gio. Protect our heartbeat." "I will," I whispered. "I swear on every mile of track I ever laid." She smiled. A small, tired, beautiful smile that I carry behind my eyes, like a photograph I never need to develop. The Hamilton ticked on, and sometime before dawn, between one tick and the next, she left. I failed that promise for 2 years. But not after tonight. Never again after tonight. I rose from the bed at 4 in the morning and moved silently to the garage through the back portal. The cold was brutal, the kind that makes your lungs ache and your eyes water. But I barely felt it. In the garage, I found a clean sheet of paper in my workbench drawer and a pencil that I sharpened with my pocket knife. I wrote by the thin light of the moon through the high window. "Nina, if something goes wrong tomorrow and I end up at Desert Pines or worse, everything you need is in the files Margaret Chen has. Do not let them tell you I went willingly. Do not let them say I was confused. I am clear. I am present. I am your father. And I am telling you with full mind and steady hand that everything they did to me was a crime. I love you. I am proud of you. Tell Evelyn's clocks. I am sorry it took me so long to wake up. Dad." I folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope, tucking it into the bottom of my old toolbox beneath a false panel I had installed in 1985 to keep emergency cash away from light-fingered apprentices. If Friday went well, no one would ever need to read it. If it did not, it would be the last honest document with my name on it. I made it back to bed by 4:30. The dispatch phone in the garage buzzed once. A text from Nina routed through the old system. "The 8:45 express is on schedule. See you at the platform. Hisel Jadis. End of fray. Senjul, 8:45. That was our signal. She would arrive at the house at 8:45. 5 minutes after Margaret Chen's team was in position. 15 minutes before the notary Keith had scheduled for 9. The timing was as precise as a switching schedule. 1 minute early or late could derail everything. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, counting the vigas one final time. The darkness outside the window began to soften from black to the deep purple that precedes a desert dawn. Somewhere in that purple distance, the Sandia Mountains were catching the first light of a Friday that would either restore my life or end it. At 6 in the morning, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. The front door opened. The smell of green chill and fresh coffee, and Keith's aftershave rolled into the hallway like a lie dressed in breakfast. "Morning, Dad." His voice was bright, performative. The voice of a man who believes he has already won and is simply collecting the trophy. He appeared in the bedroom doorway holding a paper bag and a steaming cup. "I brought your favorite, Frontier green chile breakfast burrito. And real coffee, not that instant stuff." He smiled the smile that used to make me proud and now made my stomach turn. "Ready for a great day?" I let my eyes drift toward him, slow and unfocused. I let the mask settle over my features one final time. The vacant stare, the slack mouth, the trembling hands. "Great day," I mumbled, the words thick and shapeless. Keith patted my shoulder. "That's the spirit, Dad. Just a few signatures and then you can rest all you want." He had no idea that the rest he was offering me was a cage. And he had no idea that in 2 hours and 45 minutes, the cage door was going to swing open. But not for me. For him. Friday morning arrived like a freight train with no brakes. Loud, inevitable, and aimed directly at the heart of everything I had left. Keith moved through my house with the energy of a man hosting a celebration. By 7:30, he had cleared the kitchen table completely, wiping down the scarred oak surface with a diligence he had never shown when it was just his father eating crackers alone in the dark. He produced a small vase of yellow flowers from a paper bag, chrysanthemums that looked as artificial as his smile, and placed them at the center of the table as if staging a photograph for a real estate listing. The irony was not lost on me. Sandra arrived at 7:45. She entered through the front door without knocking, her heels clicking on the saltillo tile with a rhythm that reminded me of a metronome counting down. Her face was tight, her jaw clenched, and she kept pulling her phone from her purse to check the screen every 30 seconds. She smelled of clinical hand sanitizer and something sharper underneath. Fear, perhaps. Or impatience. She glanced at me in the armchair and offered a thin smile that did not reach the flat assessment of her eyes. "You look rested, George," she said. The lie hung in the air between us like smoke. Keith was arranging papers on the table. A thick manila folder, multiple documents flagged with yellow sticky tabs that said "Sign here" in red ink. I could see the heading on the top sheet from across the room. Deed of transfer. Beneath it, a second document. Authorization of sale. And beneath that, a third page I could not read from this distance, but which I knew with cold certainty was the voluntary commitment form for Desert Pines Memory Care. At 8:15, the notary arrived. A woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a professional smile that suggested she had witnessed 1,000 mundane property transfers and expected this to be one more. Keith greeted her at the door with the handshake of a man closing a business deal, all confidence and grateful efficiency. He introduced Sandra as my father's primary caregiver and gestured toward me in the armchair as if presenting evidence of decline. "He's having a good morning," Keith told her in that low, conspiratorial tone. "More alert than usual," the doctor said to take advantage of his clear moments. The notary smiled and began arranging her stamp and seal on the table beside the documents. I watched from my armchair, maintaining the vacant expression, the slow wandering gaze, the slight tremor in my hands. Inside, my heart was a piston firing at full pressure. I was counting minutes now. 8:20, 8:25, 8:30. Keith approached me with the solicitous manner of a funeral director guiding a widow to a casket. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you to the table. Just a few quick signatures, and then you can have your burrito." He took my elbow and guided me to the chair at the head of the table. I let my steps shuffle. I let my weight lean into his grip. I let him believe he was positioning a puppet. The chair was cold beneath me. The flowers on the table smelled like nothing at all. The notary positioned herself to my left, her book open, her stamp inked and ready. Sandra stood near the kitchen door, her arms crossed, her phone clutched in her white-knuckled hand. Keith stood to my right and placed the fountain pen in my fingers with the care of a man arming a weapon. Right here, Dad. He tapped the yellow sticky tab on the deed transfer. Just your signature. Nice and easy. Before I sign this. Are you still with me? Before the door opens, I need to ask you something. Comment the word justice if you believe Nina's trap is about to spring, or comment mercy if you think George should forgive his son. Tell me which one and why. Please note that what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. But the core message is what matters most. I looked at the pen in my hand. A heavy silver instrument, expensive. The kind Keith would have purchased specifically for this occasion to make the theft feel ceremonial. I could feel the smooth, cold weight of it between my fingers, the same fingers that had gripped wrenches and coupling pins and the throttle of a 200-ton locomotive for 35 years. The tip of the pen touched paper. The point of no return. 8:43. I could feel the seconds ticking in my chest where the Hamilton used to tick on my nightstand. 2 minutes. I pressed the pen tip against the signature line, letting a small dot of ink bleed into the paper. Keith leaned forward, his breath warm and sour on my neck. Sandra took a step closer. The notary readied her stamp. 8:44. I let the pen move 1 millimeter. The beginning of a letter that could have been a G. Keith exhaled. Sandra's phone buzzed in her hand, but she ignored it. Her eyes locked on the pen tip. 8:45. The sound of a car door closing in the driveway. Then a second. Then a third. 4 doors in rapid succession. Keith's head snapped toward the window, his body stiffening like a dog, catching a scent it does not recognize. Sandra's phone buzzed again, and this time she looked at the screen. The color drained from her face, as if someone had pulled a plug at the base of her throat. The front door opened without a knock. It swung wide, and the cold December morning poured into the room, along with the clean, sharp scent of desert sage and the sound of boots on tile. Nina stepped through first, her posture straight as a rail, her eyes sweeping the room with the calculated assessment of someone who has already mapped every exit and every threat. Behind her stood a woman in a dark blue blazer, with a state seal pin on her lapel, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that meant business. Margaret Chen. And behind Margaret, 2 officers of the New Mexico State Police in crisp tan uniforms, their badges catching the morning sun that streamed through the open door like a searchlight. The pen hovered 1 millimeter above the paper. The dot of ink I had left on the signature line was the only mark I would ever make on that document. Nina's voice cut through the room like a signal horn at a grade crossing. Clear. Commanding. Impossible to ignore. Put the pen down, Dad. You don't need to sign your life away today. The pen clattered onto the table. The sound it made against the oak was small, almost comical against the enormity of what was happening. But it echoed through that room like the final click of a rail switch locking into position. The track had changed, and there was no going back. Keith's face underwent a transformation that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The confident smile collapsed inward, like a building losing its foundation, replaced by something raw and panicked that aged him 10 years in the span of 3 seconds. His eyes darted from Nina to the officers to Margaret Chen and back to Nina with the frantic calculation of a man searching for an exit in a room where every door had just been sealed. Nina? His voice cracked on her name. What is this? What are you doing here? This is a private family matter. Dad and I were just handling some routine paperwork. Margaret Chen stepped forward. She moved with the measured authority of someone who had walked into rooms like this before, who had seen the same desperate performance from the same type of predator, wearing the same mask of familial concern. She produced a leather credential case from her blazer pocket and held it open at Keith's eye level. Mr. Whitfield, I am Margaret Chen, senior investigator with the New Mexico Attorney General's Office, Elder Abuse Division. I am here pursuant to an active investigation into allegations of financial exploitation, unlawful administration of controlled substances, and fraudulent property transfer involving your father, George Whitfield. Her voice was level and precise, each word placed with the care of a mason setting stones. No one in this room is to sign, touch, or remove any documents from this table until further notice. The notary's face went white. She pulled her hands away from the documents, as if they had caught fire, her stamp clattering back into its case. I had no idea. She whispered to no one in particular. They told me this was a standard transfer. Keith raised his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of innocence that always looks most guilty when performed under pressure. There's been a misunderstanding. My father has dementia. He's confused. He doesn't know what's happening. I have full legal power of attorney. Everything we've done has been for his protection. Nina set her laptop on the table beside the unsigned documents and opened it. The screen bloomed to life, already loaded with the evidence she had assembled over 3 sleepless nights. Screenshots of the eBay listings. The Chrono 24 photographs of our clocks with their no provenance needed descriptions. The bank records showing 2 years of $17,000 monthly withdrawals. The shell company registrations linking Rio Grande Estates LLC to Lyle Dunham. The email thread between Keith and Dunham detailing the Friday timeline and the Desert Pines intake. Confused? Nina said, her voice dropping to a frequency that made the words sound like a blade being drawn. Let me show you what confusion looks like, Keith. She turned the screen toward Margaret Chen, who nodded and gestured for the officers to approach the table. Then Nina turned to me. Our eyes met, and in that look was a question and a permission. I gave her the smallest nod. It was time. I placed both palms flat on the oak table. I pressed down and rose to my feet. Not with the shuffling uncertainty of the invalid they had manufactured. Not with the trembling weakness of the drugged ghost I had been performing for 5 days. I stood the way I had stood on the platform of the Albuquerque rail yard for 35 years. Straight. Solid. My shoulders squared against the weight of authority that only a man who has been responsible for 10,000-ton machines can carry. I looked my son in the eye, and I watched the blood leave his face as he realized that the man standing before him was not the hollow shell he had been medicating into silence for 2 years. I remember everything, Keith. My voice did not shake. It did not waver. It rang through that kitchen like a signal horn clearing a crossing. Every pill Sandra put on my tongue. Every clock you carried out of this house in the dark. Every lie you told me about Nina. Every dollar you drained while I sat in that chair, unable to remember my own daughter's phone number. Keith took a step backward. His hip hit the counter, and he could go no further. His mouth opened and closed twice without producing sound. The man who had controlled every aspect of my life for 24 months suddenly could not control his own jaw. Dad, I can explain. The business was failing. I didn't have a choice. I was going to pay it all back once the contracts came through. I never meant to hurt you. I was just borrowing against the future. Borrowing. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. You don't borrow a man's life, Keith. You don't borrow his wife's memory. You don't borrow 4 years of his daughter's letters and phone calls and gifts. That's not borrowing. That's burial. Sandra had been silent through all of this, pressed against the kitchen doorway like a woman trying to melt into the wall. But as the officers moved toward Keith, as the reality of handcuffs and Miranda rights began to crystallize in the cold morning air, something shifted in her posture. I watched it happen in real time. The calculation, the survival instinct of a woman who had always known how to read a room and position herself on the winning side. She stepped away from Keith. 3 deliberate steps that crossed a distance far greater than the tile floor between them. She straightened her spine, smoothed her blouse, and fixed her gaze on Margaret Chen with the clinical composure of someone changing allegiance the way you change a dressing. Efficiently, without sentiment. I want a lawyer, Sandra said, her voice flat and professional. And I want to make a statement. Keith turned toward her, his face crumbling into something I had never seen on my son before. Genuine, naked terror. Not the fear of consequence. The fear of total abandonment. Sandra? His voice was small. A child's voice. Sandra, what are you doing? She did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on Margaret Chen, as if Keith had already ceased to exist. "Saving myself, Keith," she said. "Something you should have done 2 years ago instead of dragging us both into this. How do you watch your own family consume itself? How do you stand in the center of a collapse you survived and feel anything other than the cold wind blowing through the wreckage?" I stood at that kitchen table with the unsigned deed before me and the fountain pen lying where it fell, and I watched my son realize that the woman he trusted had just switched tracks, leaving him alone on a rail with no signal and no brakes. The room fell silent except for the sound of Keith's breathing, rapid and shallow, and the distant hum of the refrigerator that had mocked my hunger for 2 years. Margaret Chen nodded to one of the officers, who produced a small digital recorder from his belt. "Mrs. Whitfield, we can arrange counsel, but if you'd like to make a voluntary statement now, we're listening." Sandra straightened her shoulders, and she began to talk. Sandra spoke with the clinical detachment of a woman reading a medical chart rather than confessing to a crime. Her voice was steady, her words precise, stripped of emotion the way a surgical tool is stripped of everything unnecessary. She had spent 2 years administering poison with that same efficiency, and now she was administering truth with identical cold precision. The medication was zolpidem. 10 milligrams nightly for the first 6 months, she told Margaret Chen, her eyes fixed on a point above the investigator's shoulder, rather than on any human face in the room. After the first year, when he began showing tolerance, I increased to 15 milligrams. The samples came from the clinic where I work. Physician samples. No prescription trail, no pharmacy record. I logged them as distributed to patients on my rounds, but they went home in my purse every evening. Margaret's pen moved across her notepad in quick, practiced strokes. And the purpose of the medication? Compliance. Sandra said the word without flinching. Keith needed him docile enough to sign documents and incapable enough to question where the money was going. The zolpidem, at that dosage, creates anterograde amnesia. He could function in the moment, but form no new long-term memories. It mimics organic dementia almost perfectly on clinical evaluation. I stood at the table and listened to the blueprint of my erasure laid out in pharmaceutical terminology. 2 years of my life, reduced to dosages and intake schedules. 2 years of sunrises I could not remember and meals I never received, explained away as side effects of a carefully calibrated chemical program designed to keep me just alive enough to hold a pen. "And the clocks?" Margaret asked. "That was Dunham's arrangement with Keith." Sandra's voice dropped slightly, the first crack in her professional veneer. Lyle Dunham approached Keith at a bar in Las Cruces in August 2023. He specializes in acquiring estate items from elderly owners who are in compromised mental states. He offered below-market prices, cash only, no receipts. Keith delivered the items to him personally, or Dunham came to the house after midnight when George was fully sedated. Keith stood frozen against the kitchen counter, his face a gray mask of disbelief. He was staring at Sandra as if seeing a stranger inhabit the body of someone he thought he knew. When she finished her last sentence, something inside him broke with an audible sound. Not a word. Something more primal. A jagged inhalation that turned into a keening sob. "Dad." He stepped forward, his hands reaching toward me. One of the officers moved to intercept, but I held up my hand. I wanted to hear what my son had to say, while the cuffs were still in the officer's belt rather than on his wrists. "Dad, I'm sorry." The words came out in pieces, shattered by the sobbing that made his chest heave. The business, the debts. I was losing everything. The contracts dried up. The fuel costs doubled. I had crews that needed payroll and suppliers threatening lawsuits, and I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I just had enough time and enough capital, I could turn it around and pay everything back before you ever noticed. I let him finish. I owed him that much. Not as forgiveness, but as a record. I wanted every person in that room to hear the mathematics of how a son convinces himself that stealing his father's life is just a temporary loan. Then I spoke. And my voice was not the voice of a forgiving patriarch. It was the voice of a man standing over the wreckage of everything he built. You didn't just steal my money, Keith. Each word fell like a hammer on cold iron. You stole the last sounds of your mother's voice. Those clocks were her heartbeat. Every tick was a morning she wound them with her own hands. Every chime was a conversation we had while she polished the glass. You carried her out of this house in cardboard boxes and sold her to a stranger for pennies on the dollar. And then you told me my daughter was ashamed of me, so that no one would be left to hear me scream. Keith's legs gave out. He slid down the cabinet behind him until he sat on the cold tile floor, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not pity. Just the hollow, ringing silence that follows the last echo of a horn in an empty rail yard. The back door opened. Frank Harjo stepped inside, his phone held steady in his weathered hand, the screen showing a recording that had been running since 8:30. He had positioned himself at the kitchen window, capturing the entire confrontation through the glass. Backup evidence, in case Sandra's testimony was later recanted or challenged. The signal engineer, ensuring the record showed exactly what happened and when. Got all of it, Frank said quietly to Margaret Chen. Audio and video. Time-stamped. Margaret nodded and turned to the officers. The taller one stepped forward and spoke the words that made it final. Keith Whitfield, you are under arrest for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, unlawful administration of controlled substances, fraud, and conspiracy to commit involuntary commitment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Keith did not resist. He rose from the floor with the slow mechanical movements of a man walking through deep water. His hands extended forward for the cuffs with a compliance that was its own kind of confession. As the metal clicked around his wrists, he turned his head toward me one final time. Dad. Just the word. Just my name in his mouth. Small and broken and asking for something I was not prepared to give. I did not turn around. I stood facing the bare wall where the Hamilton 992B had hung for 46 years, and I let the officers walk my son through the living room, across the threshold, and out into the cold December morning. The sound of the front door closing behind him was not a slam. It was a quiet click. The same sound a cell makes when it locks for the first time. When the engines faded from the driveway, Margaret Chen set her notepad down and looked at me with an expression that mixed professional sympathy with genuine respect. Mr. Whitfield, there's one more thing you should know. She pulled her phone from her blazer and showed me a text message. Lyle Dunham was arrested simultaneously by our team in Las Cruces 40 minutes ago. The search warrant for his warehouse was executed at 8:15 this morning. We found property belonging to 11 other elderly victims across 3 counties. Your daughter's evidence package gave us the probable cause we needed to dismantle his entire operation. I looked at Nina, who stood by the table with her arms wrapped around herself, her fierce composure finally beginning to crack at the edges. Tears she had refused to shed for 5 days were gathering in her eyes. You didn't just save me, I said, my voice thick. You saved 11 other families sitting in the dark. She closed the distance between us and wrapped her arms around me. I felt her shoulders shake once, then still. The fierce girl with iron in her spine held me upright in my own kitchen, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence in this house did not feel like a grave. It felt like a beginning. Justice does not arrive like a freight train. It arrives like the slow warming of a desert morning, degree by degree, until the frost that nearly killed you finally loosens its grip on the ground. The 3 weeks that followed Keith's arrest moved with the deliberate pace of a legal system processing the weight of what my son had done. I spent those weeks gradually reclaiming the functions that 2 years of Zolpidem had eroded. My sleep returned naturally, no longer chemically enforced but earned through the honest exhaustion of a man rebuilding his life. My appetite sharpened. My legs grew steadier. The fog that had wrapped my brain in wet wool thinned and receded like morning mist burning off the Rio Grande. Nina handled the legal machinery with the same relentless efficiency she brought to software engineering. She had retained an attorney named David Reyes, a sharp-eyed man from a firm in Old Town that specialized in elder exploitation cases. I watched her sit at my kitchen table with Reyes across from her, the two of them building a case with the structural precision of engineers, constructing a bridge that needed to bear impossible weight without showing a single crack. The first victory came on a Tuesday. The second mortgage, $250,000 placed against my fully paid home through Rio Grande Estates LLC, authorized by a power of attorney obtained under chemical coercion. Reyes filed a motion to void the lien based on fraudulent inducement, and the judge granted it within 72 hours. The speed of the ruling told me that Margaret Chen's investigation had generated enough pressure to make the legal system move with unusual urgency. The lien was dissolved. The house was mine again. Truly mine. With no invisible claims lurking in the county recorder's files. The pension was secured next. A new independent trust was established, managed by a fiduciary appointed by the court, with no family member having access or authority. $17,000 a month would flow into that trust, and out again to me, and only me, for the remainder of my life. The money that Keith had drained was gone, consumed by the corpse of his trucking company and the bottomless appetite of Dunham's interest payments. But the bleeding had stopped. The future was protected even if the past could not be recovered. Then came the sentencing. Keith received 8 years in federal custody. Wire fraud. Elder financial exploitation. Conspiracy. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and a voice that could have frozen the Rio Grande in July, told my son that the systematic nature of his crime, the deliberate drugging, the calculated isolation, the planned institutionalization, elevated his offense beyond simple theft into something she called a sustained assault on human dignity. Keith stood in his orange jumpsuit and said nothing. I did not attend the sentencing. Nina told me about it afterward, and that was enough. Dunham received 12 years. The RICO charges stuck. His warehouse in Las Cruces yielded property from 11 other elderly victims, families across 3 counties who had been quietly stripped of heirlooms and antiques while chemically compromised or physically isolated by people they trusted. The scope of his operation made the local news, then the state news, then a brief mention on a national broadcast that Nina showed me on her phone one evening. Sandra received 2 years of supervised probation, a permanent ban from healthcare employment, and the requirement to testify fully in both Keith's and Dunham's trials. She cooperated completely, which is why she walked free while my son did not. I have no opinion on whether that trade was fair. Fairness is a concept I stopped believing in the night I found that pill bottle. But it was on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the arrests, that I discovered the cost my daughter had paid to save me. I was sitting in David Reyes's office, reviewing the final trust documents, when my eyes drifted to a folder on his desk labeled Payment Schedule. The top page was visible, and one line caught my attention with the force of a slap. Retainer paid. $30,000. Source: Nina Whitfield. Personal savings account. I stared at the number. Then I asked Reyes where that money had come from. He hesitated, looking toward the door, as if hoping Nina might appear to handle the conversation herself. When she did not, he told me. Nina had sold her apartment in Austin. The 1-bedroom condominium she had purchased 4 years ago with the down payment she had saved since graduate school. She had also sold her car, and she had taken an indefinite leave of absence from her engineering position to remain in Albuquerque and manage the legal proceedings. The $30,000 represented not just a payment, but the liquidation of every financial foothold my 39-year-old daughter had built in her adult life. She had burned her own future to rebuild mine. I found her in the garden that evening, pulling weeds from the flower bed that had been neglected for 2 years. The setting sun turned the Sandia Mountains pink and gold behind her, and for a moment she looked so much like Evelyn kneeling in that same soil that my breath caught in my chest. Nina. My voice was careful, measured. The retainer. David told me where this money came from. She did not look up immediately. Her hands kept working the soil, pulling dead roots from the earth with methodical precision. It's just money, Dad, she said quietly. You can't put a price on getting your father back. You sold your home, your car. You gave up your job. She sat back on her heels and finally looked at me. Her eyes were clear and fierce and without a trace of regret. You spent 35 years on frozen rail yards at 3 in the morning so I could go to college. You worked doubles every Christmas so Mom and I could have presents under the tree. You poured every penny into a pension fund so you and Mom could retire with dignity. She brushed the soil from her hands. What I gave was nothing compared to what they took from you, and nothing compared to what you gave me first. I could not speak. The words I wanted to say were too large for my throat, so I simply sat down beside her in the dirt, my old knees protesting, and together we pulled weeds in silence as the sun dropped below the mountains. 2 days later, a package arrived by courier. A heavy cardboard box marked Evidence Release, NM Attorney General's Office. Nina signed for it and brought it to the kitchen table. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and sealed in a protective case, was the Hamilton 992B. I opened the case with hands that trembled for reasons that had nothing to do with medication. The gold case caught the kitchen light. The crystal face was unscratched, and when I held it to my ear, pressing the cool metal against my skin, I heard it. Tick, 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 steady, perfect, faithful as the day Evelyn placed it in my hands 46 years ago. The tears came then. The first honest tears I had shed since the night I found the zolpidem. They fell onto the glass face of the Hamilton, and I did not wipe them away. I let them fall because they were not tears of grief or rage or relief. They were tears of reunion. Evelyn's heartbeat had come home. She's still ticking, Dad, Nina whispered beside me. After everything, she's still here. I carried the Hamilton to Evelyn's grave because she needed to hear it ticking again, and because I needed her counsel one final time before I decided what kind of man I would be for the years I had left. The National Cemetery in Albuquerque sits on the eastern edge of the city, where the land begins its slow climb toward the Sandia Mountains. It is a place of precise rows and measured distances. Every headstone aligned with military exactness. Every plot numbered and catalogued, with the same attention to order that governed my life on the railroad. Evelyn would have appreciated the symmetry. She always said that beauty lives in the mathematics of things placed correctly. I drove there on a Friday afternoon, exactly 1 month after the morning that had changed everything. The December sun was already beginning its early descent, painting the western sky in shades of amber and violet that only the high desert can produce. The air smelled of sage and cold earth, and the faint mineral tang of distant snow on the mountain peaks. I walked the gravel path between the headstones, with the Hamilton in my coat pocket, its weight against my chest, steady and warm as a second heartbeat. Evelyn Ann Whitfield, 1954 to 2022. Beloved wife, beloved mother, keeper of time. I had chosen those last 3 words myself. The monument company had suggested the standard phrases. Devoted grandmother, forever in our hearts, resting in peace. But Evelyn was none of those generic sentiments. She was the woman who wound 42 clocks every Sunday morning in a specific sequence she had memorized by feel, starting with the smallest pocket watch on the bottom shelf and ending with the Hamilton 992B on the top, her fingers moving with the same precision a conductor brings to a symphony. She kept time, not just on the clocks but in our lives. She kept the rhythm of our family beating steady, and when she left, the rhythm collapsed. I sat on the granite bench beside her headstone and pulled the Hamilton from my pocket. The late afternoon light caught the gold case, throwing a warm reflection across the engraved letters of her name. I set it on the flat top of the headstone, leaning against the stone so she could hear it. Tick, tick, tick. I brought her back, I said to the still air. Took me 2 years too long, but she's home. The wind moved through the cemetery grass with a sound like a slow exhalation. I let the silence hold for a moment, listening to the Hamilton mark the seconds against the vast quiet of the dead. He broke his promise to you, Evelyn. My voice was steady, but the words carried a weight that pressed against my ribs. The boy who knelt right here and swore he would be my rock. He crumbled, and he took me with him, and he nearly buried us both. A memory rose unbidden. Keith at 6 years old, standing on a step stool in our kitchen, watching Evelyn wind the Hamilton with rapt fascination. His small hands reaching toward the mechanism, wanting to touch the gears, wanting to understand how something so beautiful could be so precise. "Can I try, Mom?" he had asked, his voice high and eager. Evelyn had guided his fingers to the crown with infinite patience. "Gently, Keith. A clock is honest. It only tells you two things: where you are and how much time you have left. A clock never lies, so you must never lie to it." He had nodded with the solemnity of a child making a sacred promise. And for decades, I believed he had kept it. I believed the boy who loved the clocks had grown into a man who would honor the time they represented. I was wrong, but sitting here now, with the Hamilton ticking faithfully against Evelyn's headstone, I had to ask myself a question that had been circling my mind like a hawk over the desert since the morning they put Keith in handcuffs. What did she want me to do with what remained? Was it revenge I sought? The satisfaction of watching my son rot in a cell for 8 years while his life disintegrated the way mine had? I tested that idea against the feel of the cold granite beneath me and found it hollow. Revenge is a clock that runs backward. It measures nothing useful and leads nowhere worth arriving. Was it forgiveness? The warm, easy absolution that church sermons and greeting cards promise will heal every wound? I tested that too, and found it dishonest. Forgiveness without accountability is just permission for the next betrayal. It is a signal light set permanently to green regardless of what is coming down the track. The answer came not from my own mind, but from somewhere deeper. From the same place that the 315 horn had reached when 2 years of chemicals could not silence it. From the bedrock beneath the fog. Accountability with purpose. Keith would serve his sentence. He would face every consequence the law demanded. I would not intervene. I would not soften. But I would not spend my remaining years staring at the walls of his cell through the glass of my own bitterness. That was a different kind of prison, and I had already served enough time behind invisible bars. Instead, I would build. Not a building. Not a business. Something that Evelyn would recognize as worthy of the time we had been given. "You asked me to protect the clocks," I said, running my thumb across the warm gold of the Hamilton's case. "I failed for 2 years, but I am not going to fail the next person sitting alone in the dark, listening to their life tick away. That I can promise you." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pinyon smoke from somewhere in the valley below. For a moment, just a moment, it smelled exactly like the perfume Evelyn wore on cold evenings. Cedar and smoke and something sweet beneath it all. I picked up the Hamilton and held it in both hands, feeling its tick pulse against my palms like a tiny living thing. Then I stood, my knees protesting as they always did now, and I looked out across the desert toward the fading sun. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called Nina. She picked up on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" "Everything is clear," I said. "I know what I want to do with whatever comes back from this. Whatever restitution, whatever recovery money the state manages to claw back from Dunham's assets. I want to build something." Build what? I watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the western mesas, leaving the sky streaked with gold and deep purple. A freight horn sounded somewhere to the south, faint and distant, rolling across the desert floor like a promise. I want to make sure no one else sits in the dark, listening to their life get stolen. I want to build something your mother would be proud of. There was a pause. Then Nina's voice came back, thick with emotion but steady with the iron that had saved my life. "Tell me what you need, Dad." I'm in. 6 months later, the 315 freight horn is no longer an alarm. It is a lullaby. A steady, familiar voice in the darkness that says the same thing every night. You are still here, George. You are still on schedule. The world is still turning, and you are turning with it. The house smells different now. Not the stale medicinal air of dust and neglect that had settled into every surface during my 2 years of captivity. Now it smells of pinion smoke drifting in through windows that stay open because I choose to open them. It smells of coffee brewed strong at 5 in the morning because I wake on my own terms now. My body rising with the first gray light, rather than being dragged from chemical sleep by the sound of Sandra's footsteps. It smells of garlic bread burning in the oven, because neither Nina nor I have mastered the timing of the old broiler. And at this point, the running joke has become a tradition we refuse to correct. Nina works from the converted sunroom at the back of the house, the room where Evelyn used to keep her sewing machine and her collection of railroad history books. I can hear her voice through the open door during her video meetings, explaining software architecture to junior engineers in Austin with the same patient precision her mother used when teaching me to wind the delicate spring of a pocket watch without over-torquing the mainspring. Sometimes I sit in the kitchen and listen, not to the technical content, but to the sound of my daughter's voice filling this house with life again. A sound I was told I would never hear. A sound my son tried to erase from my world so thoroughly that for 4 years I believed the silence was her choice. On Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I drive to the Albuquerque Railroad Museum on 1st Street. The building is a converted roundhouse from the Atchison-Topeka era. Its brick walls still blackened by decades of locomotive exhaust, its high arched windows letting in the same desert light that once illuminated the faces of engineers preparing for overnight freight runs. I volunteer there now, 3 mornings a week, leading tours for school groups and telling stories to children who look up at the massive steel wheels with the same wonder I felt the first time my father took me to see a train at age 4. Last Tuesday, a boy, no older than 7, raised his hand during my presentation on signal systems. "Mr. George, how does the train know which track to take?" he asked, his face serious with the gravity of a genuine question. I knelt down to his level, my old knees protesting but holding. "It doesn't choose, son. Someone has to set the switch. Someone has to make sure the signal is right. And someone has to watch, all the time, to make sure nobody changes the track when the train isn't looking." He nodded slowly, processing this with the deep solemnity of a child encountering a new truth. I thought of Keith at that age, asking similar questions with similar eyes, and the thought no longer landed with the crushing weight it once carried. It settled gently, like dust on a shelf, acknowledged, but not disturbing. The timekeeper's watch meets every Wednesday evening in the basement of the Alhambra Public Library on Central Avenue. There are 9 of us now, survivors of financial exploitation, guardianship fraud, medication abuse, and isolation schemes. We sit in folding chairs beneath fluorescent lights, drinking coffee from paper cups, and we share what was done to us without shame. More importantly, we share what we learned, what to watch for, what questions to ask, what signals mean danger when they come from the people closest to you. Frank Harjo brings donuts every session. He sits in the back row with his spiral notebook, taking notes the same way he documented the license plates on Dunham's van, and he offers his testimony to anyone who needs to hear that vigilance is not paranoia. It is love expressed through attention. 3 weeks ago, a woman named Rosa Gallegos came to us. 79 years old, thin as a sparrow and trembling with the particular fear of someone who has just realized that the nephew handling her affairs has been systematically draining her checking account for 11 months. Her voice shook when she spoke, but by the end of the meeting, she was sitting straighter. We connected her with a pro bono attorney from the Legal Aid Society the next morning. Within 2 weeks, the nephew's power of attorney was revoked, his access to her accounts frozen, and an investigation opened by Adult Protective Services. Rosa hugged me after the second meeting, her arms surprisingly strong for such a small woman. "You saved my house, George," she whispered. I thought of the hollow man I had been 6 months ago, the ghost shuffling through his own hallways, unable to find the front door, And I realized that in saving others, I had completed the work of saving myself. The man Keith tried to manufacture, the senile ghost ready for desert pines, had become something he never could have predicted. A watchman, a keeper of signals, a man who makes sure the switches are set correctly so the people behind him stay on the right track. Every month, a thin envelope arrives in the mail from a federal correctional facility in Florence, Arizona. Inside is a check for $150 and a folded sheet of lined paper with Keith's handwriting. The first arrived 8 weeks after the sentencing. The note on the back was 3 sentences. Week 1. Assigned to machine shop. Hands are blistered, but I showed up on time. The subsequent notes have grown longer by small increments. Week 6. Learning to weld. Instructor says, I have steady hands. Didn't tell him where I got them. Week 12. Foreman said I'm reliable. First time anyone said that in years. Still showing up. Week 20. Thought about mom today. Remembered how she wound the clocks every Sunday. Left to right. Small to large. I remember the order now. I forward every check to the account Nina set up for her restitution fund. I do not write back. Not yet. The day may come when I can hold a pen and address an envelope to my son without feeling the ghost of that fountain pen he placed in my hand on a Friday morning in December. But that day is not today. Today, accountability looks like silence and patience, and $150 a month placed without comment into the account of the daughter he tried to erase. Nina found me on the back portal last Sunday evening, watching the sunset turn the sandias the color of hammered copper. She handed me a mug of coffee and sat in the chair beside me. The same chair where Evelyn used to sit on Tuesday evenings, listening for the 7:12 freight. You know what I realized today? She said. Her hands wrapped around her own mug. What's that, Professor? She smiled at the title. I realized this is the first time in my adult life that I've lived somewhere I actually want to stay. I looked at her. At the fierce girl who had dismantled a criminal operation with a laptop and a legal pad. At the daughter who had liquidated her future to rebuild my past. At the woman her mother always knew she would become. Well, I said, lifting my coffee toward the mountains. The house has a spare room. The commute to your sunroom is about 12 steps. And I promise not to burn the garlic bread more than twice a week. She laughed. A sound that has finally come home to these walls after far too many years of silence. Every night at 3:15, the freight horn sounds from the Barella's yard. I hear it now, not as an alarm or a lifeline, but as confirmation. The trains are still running. The signals are still true, and the railman is still on schedule. Still watching. Still keeping time. Looking back at this painful family story, I realize something that still stings like desert wind against an open wound. I spent 35 years keeping trains running safely through mountains and storms in the dead of night. I checked every signal. I verified every switch. I never cleared a locomotive for departure without knowing that every coupling was secure and every brake was tested. Yet, I failed to notice the most dangerous derailment of all, the one happening inside my own home, carried out by the people I trusted to keep me safe when I finally stepped off the platform. This story is not only about betrayal. It is about silence. It is about pride. And it is about the catastrophic danger of trusting blindly when vigilance is what love actually requires. I believed that keeping peace meant avoiding hard questions. I believed that family blood was a guarantee of loyalty that needed no maintenance, no inspection, no verification. I treated my relationship with my son the way a careless engineer treats a stretch of track he has traveled 1,000 times. Familiar, routine, safe. I stopped checking the signals because I assumed they would always be green. And in that assumption, I gave someone the opportunity to switch the track beneath me without my knowledge or consent. I know you are listening to this. And I believe with every fiber of my being that the Lord guided this story to your ears at this exact moment for a reason. When I sat in that dark living room, unable to remember my own daughter's name, unable to find the strength to reach for a glass of water. I did not know that help was already in motion. I did not know that a trucker named Big Jim on Interstate 40 would become the instrument of my salvation, or that an old CB radio gathering dust in my garage would become the voice that crossed the desert to reach my daughter's ears. The Lord works through signals we cannot always see, through frequencies we have forgotten how to tune, through the steady heartbeat of a clock that refuses to stop ticking even when everything else has gone silent. If there is one lesson I can leave behind through this story, it is this. Never surrender your voice just to keep the illusion of harmony. Pay attention to actions, not promises. A clock never lies, but people do. So watch the signals, verify the switches, and never assume that the track ahead is clear, simply because it was clear yesterday. I failed to ask my son the hard questions. How is the business doing? Show me the statements. Let me speak to my daughter directly. These were simple signals I could have checked, simple questions that might have stopped the derailment before it started. But I confused love with trust, and trust with silence, and silence with peace. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. A train only runs safely when someone is watching the signals. A life only runs safely under the same condition. I know there are those listening who will say that what happened to me was extraordinary, that it could never happen in their family, that their children, their in-laws, their caregivers would never cross that line. I believed the same thing. I believed it with the same certainty I brought to every train I dispatched for 35 years. And I was wrong. Not because my judgment was poor, but because I made the mistake of believing that love is a static condition rather than a living system that requires constant maintenance, constant attention, and constant honesty. Many will ask why I didn't simply forgive and forget, why I allowed the law to take its full course against my own son. I will tell you what Evelyn told me from beyond the silence of her headstone on a Friday afternoon when the sage-scented wind carried her voice across the cemetery grass. You don't save a man by shielding him from truth. You save him by making him strong enough to face it. Accountability is not punishment. It is the only foundation strong enough to rebuild upon. And I believe with all my heart that the Lord does not ask us to forgive in a way that enables destruction. He asks us to forgive in a way that demands transformation. Keith is not beyond redemption, but redemption requires the full weight of consequence before it can begin its work. Today, I try to hold on to faith and humility. I believe the timing of the Lord placed that 315 freight horn at exactly the right moment to pierce through 2 years of chemical darkness and wake the man beneath the medication. I believe He placed a CB radio in my garage and a truck driver on Interstate 40, and a daughter with iron in her spine exactly where they needed to be, at exactly the moment they were needed. Coincidence is just the Lord working on a frequency we have not yet learned to hear. The last thing I hear every night before sleep takes me is the steady tick of the Hamilton 992B on my nightstand. Evelyn's wedding gift. 21 jewels. 1947. Recovered from a criminal's warehouse and returned to the nightstand where it belongs, counting the seconds of a life that nearly ended in a locked room full of shadows and empty shelves. I press my ear to the pillow and I listen to it tick. And in that sound, I hear everything I almost lost. Every Tuesday sunset with Evelyn. Every Sunday morning winding the clocks together. Every laugh Nina has brought back to these walls. Every freight horn rolling through the darkness. Keeping time, keeping schedule. Keeping faith that the morning will come. The railman found his way home. And this time, he is never leaving the station again. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey. I would truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you woke up in George Whitfield's position? Trapped in your own home. Your mind being erased by the people you trusted most. Share your perspective in the comments so we can learn from each other. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you will not miss future stories that explore difficult family choices, resilience, and the courage it takes to fight back when the people you love become the people you fear. And if you know someone who is elderly, who lives alone, who seems to be fading in ways that do not quite make sense. Check on them. Ask the hard questions. Watch the signals. You might be the 3:15 horn that wakes them up before it is too late. This story was inspired by real social issues affecting elderly Americans, including financial exploitation, medication abuse, and isolation. While certain details were dramatized for narrative purposes, the core message reflects documented patterns of elder abuse that affect millions of families each year. If this type of content is not your preference, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that may suit you.